I did not go to the gate to meet her. That was not cruelty. It was policy, the same policy I had applied to every arrangement that had arrived at Valethorn in the 31 years I had held this keep. The compact is honored, the party received, the terms met, and nothing more is implied by the meeting than the terms themselves. My steward, Orphan, handled arrivals. My captain, Bryn, managed the escort. I managed the keep, the plateau packs, the river gorge border, and the 10,000 other things that constituted the work of ruling, and I did not stand at gates. So it was Orphan who told me that first evening that she had arrived with one bag, a cloak too light for a Valethorn autumn, and the composure of a woman who had been handed to strangers before and knew the only useful response was to let nothing show. She asked where the eastern stores were, Orphan said, in the careful tone he used when he was telling me something he thought I should find interesting without wanting to be the one to say so. Before she had even seen her room, she said she understood she would be keeping inventory. I said that was correct. She was here under the Cenovar Compact, a border accord between my pack and the lowland families whose territory abutted our southern ridge. Her family had offered her as a gesture of good faith. I had accepted because the alternative was a season of skirmishes I did not have the appetite for. She would keep the eastern stores, manage the winter ledgers, have a room in the keep's quieter wing, and want for nothing material. When the compact's 3-year term ended, she could go home or stay as she chose. I had said as much in the written terms, and I meant it. Her name is Senna, Orphan said, as if I had not read the compact. I know her name, I said. He left without further comment, which was one of the things I valued about Orphan. The eastern wing of Valethorn was the oldest part of the keep, the original stone, cut 300 years before my grandfather's time, when the Lycan kings of the plateau built to last and not to impress. The corridors there were narrower, the ceilings lower, the windows small and deep-set against the gorge wind. It was also, by accident of renovation, the warmest wing in autumn, because the old heating flues still ran beneath those floors, and no one had thought to reroute them. I had put her there for purely practical reasons. A woman from the lowlands would feel the plateau cold in her bones before the first frost. I told myself this when I noticed, 2 days after her arrival, that I had taken the eastern corridor twice in one morning. The first time I could account for, the ledger room was down that way, and I needed the summer tallies. The second time was less explicable. I had been in the north courtyard, reviewing the patrol rotations with Bryn, and when we finished, I had simply turned east instead of west. I realized it when I was already past the junction. I turned around and went the way I had intended to go, and spent the rest of the morning giving my full attention to the patrol schedules and not thinking about the eastern corridor at all. On the third day, I noticed my wolves. I keep a pack of 7, not the plateau wolves who follow the Lycan bloodline in the old sense, but a bred pack, my personal guard wolves, raised in the keep since they were pups and bonded to me in the way such animals bond. Loyal, attentive, and wholly indifferent to anyone who was not me or Bryn or Orphan. They slept outside my chamber. They followed me through the keep. They were not, as a rule, interested in strangers. On the morning of the third day, I came out of my chamber to find all 7 of them absent. I found them in the eastern corridor, outside a door I knew was hers, lying in a loose pile with the comfortable absence of urgency that wolves reserve for places they have decided they belong. I stood there for a moment. Bryn, coming up behind me, made a sound that in a less disciplined soldier would have been a laugh. "Move them," I said. "Yes, my lord," Bryn said, "then they'll come back." "I know," I said. "Move them anyway." They came back. I moved them 3 more times over the following week before I stopped, because moving them was drawing more attention than leaving them there, and I was not going to explain to my senior counsel that the Lycan king was engaged in a sustained argument with his own wolves about where they chose to sleep. I had a formal dinner with my senior counsel on the 9th day after Senna's arrival, a regular occurrence, nothing to do with her, a quarterly review of the plateau accords and the winter supply projections. Senna was not invited. She was not of the council, not of the senior household, not titled in any way that my council would recognize. She was, in the terms they would use when they thought I wasn't listening, a compact girl from the lowlands, and while no one was discourteous enough to say so to my face, I was not unaware of the register in which they spoke of her. They were not cruel. Valethorn's council was too senior and too experienced for overt cruelty. But there was a quality to the way Elder Voss said the Senevar girl that carried its own particular weight, a faint emphasis on the word girl, that meant. She is not real in our world, she is a note in the ledger, she will not last the compact. Elder Crane, who was older than Voss and more careful with language, said nothing at all on the subject, which was its own statement. My General Aldrich was courteous and uninterested in equal measure. I listened to their quarterly review, confirmed 3 of their 4 recommendations, tabled the 4th, and went to bed without further conversation. In the corridor outside the Great Hall, I passed the Moon Seal. It was a feature of Valethorn so old that most of my household had forgotten what it was. A carved disc of pale stone, set into the floor of the main corridor where it met the eastern passage, inlaid with silver that had gone dark long before I was born. My grandmother had told me what it was once, when I was young enough to find such things interesting rather than merely historical. A bond stone, she called it. The old name was something older than the Lycan tongue, something the plateau had used when the keeping of mates was a ritual, and the keep itself was understood to be alive to the pack's heart. The stone was supposed to warm, she said, when the pack's alpha brought his true bond through the keep. It had been cold and dark my entire life. My grandmother's grandmother had been the last to see it lit. I did not step on it. I went around it, as I always did, the way one goes around furniture, out of habit rather than reverence. The next morning, Orphan mentioned, with the same careful neutrality he applied to everything he thought I should find interesting, that the Moon Seal had been giving off a faint warmth for the past several days. The heating flues, I said. The heating flues don't run under the main corridor, Orphan said. They run under the eastern wing. I did not answer him. She walks that corridor every morning, he said, to the stores. I'm aware of her route, I said. Yes, my lord, he said, and left. I went to the main corridor in the middle of that afternoon when it was likely to be quiet, and I stood beside the Moon Seal and looked at it. It was not glowing. It was not lit in the dramatic way my grandmother's stories had suggested. But there was something, a faint, even warmth radiating from the pale stone, the way a hearthstone holds heat long after the fire has been let out. I pressed 2 fingers to the edge of it. It was warm. I straightened, and I went back to work, and I spent the rest of that day thinking about patrol schedules and winter supply and the plateau border, and not about the Moon Seal or the eastern corridor or the way my 7 wolves had given up sleeping outside my chamber. There was a library in Valethorn's middle tower, a small room, really, lined with the accumulated records of 3 centuries of Lycan kings, the kind of archive that was more duty than pleasure, but that I had spent real time in over the years, because I found that understanding what my predecessors had done badly was the most useful education available. I went there most evenings, after the keep's work was done, because it was quiet and the chair was good, and no one came looking for the Lycan king in his own library at the end of the day. On the 14th evening after Senna's arrival, I came in and found her there. She was at the far table, with what appeared to be 3 generations of inventory records spread in front of her, and a lamp positioned with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to use light sparingly. She looked up when I came in, and then she stood, the reflex of someone accustomed to being in spaces that turned out to belong to someone else. I'll go, she said, not apologetically, not with the particular diminishment that some people in her position would have used. Simply a statement of fact, adjusted to the situation. You don't have to, I said, because it was true. She stood for a moment as if assessing whether that was also a statement of fact or something more complicated. Then she sat back down. I took my usual chair on the other side of the room, and we were quiet together for a while, she with her inventories and I with the border records I had come to look at, and neither of us said anything. After perhaps half an hour, the quality of the silence shifted in some way that I would have been unable to precisely describe. It became, without effort, the silence of 2 people who have decided not to be strangers. The inventory from 40 years ago is in a different hand, she said, not looking up. There was a transition around the winter of the 3rd Aldrich year. Do you know what happened? Steward change, I said. My father's first steward died. There was a period where my father kept the records himself. She looked up then. Something crossed her face, not pity, nothing as soft as that. Recognition of something. He kept them precisely, she said, looking back at the page. He was precise about almost everything, I said. Almost. I considered for a moment. He was not precise about what he wanted. He was exact about what was required of him. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I understand that. It was the first thing she had said that was about herself. It arrived quietly, with no weight placed on it. The way certain honest things are said without drama because they are simply true. I did not say anything in return. But I stayed in the library until the lamp burned low, and she stayed until it was clear the evening was done, and we walked back through the main corridor in the same direction, she turning east, I turning north, and I noticed, as she passed the moon seal, that the silver in it caught the lamplight differently than stone should. After that, we were in the library most evenings. It was not arranged. It simply happened the way things happen when two people are in the same keep, and have both discovered that a certain room is quiet at a certain hour. We talked sometimes about the records. She had a precise mind and an eye for anomalies in the old tallies that surprised me, and sometimes we talked about other things. The plateau, which she had never seen before. The gorge, which she found beautiful in a way that she said she hadn't expected. The winter, which was coming faster than the lowlands would prepare her for. "I've been cold before," she said one evening when I had mentioned the coming frost. "Not like this," I said. "You don't know what kind of cold I've been," she said, and there was something underneath the words that she did not elaborate on and I did not press. I began to understand, in that library, what I had not understood from the compact. She had been given away by people who considered her a ledger item, not with cruelty, necessarily, but with the particular indifference of those who have never troubled themselves to look at what they have. She had spent her life in the company of people who looked through her. She was not damaged by this in the way that some people are damaged. She had not bent or diminished. She had simply learned to expect nothing and attend carefully to what she had. I recognized something in that. I could not have said what exactly. I had not been given away. But there was a register of aloneness that I knew, the kind that settles in when you have ruled long enough that the people around you relate to the title rather than the man, and you have let it happen because it was easier than the alternative. I stopped leaving things for her to find, the warmer cloak, the refilled lamp, and started leaving them in plain sight while she was there to see. "You didn't have to do that," she said one evening when she arrived to find the lamp already lit. "I know," I said. She looked at me for a moment with the careful attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. Then she sat down and said nothing more about it. The moon seal warmed further through the following weeks. Orphan stopped mentioning it. I stopped pretending not to have noticed it. The warmth was steady now, not dramatic, not the lit silver blaze of my grandmother's stories, but present. Real. The kind of warmth that is not new but has been there a long time, finally beginning to be felt. My wolves refused to be moved. I stopped trying. There were evenings when Senna would pass through the main corridor on her way back from the stores, and the wolves would follow her, all 7 of them, in a loose and companionable procession. And she would walk with them without fuss, without coaxing, just walking, her hand trailing along the nearest warm side, and by the time she reached the eastern wing they were all at her door. Once coming back from a late council review, I passed the eastern corridor and heard, not what I expected, which was silence, but the low sound of her voice. She was talking to the wolves, not commands, not the focused tone of someone giving orders to animals. She was telling them something, quietly, in the easy rhythm of a person who has been talking to creatures who cannot answer for long enough that it has become comfortable. I could not hear the words. I stood in the junction for a moment and then walked on, and I spent the rest of that night doing the very precise and contained work of not thinking about it. It was the library conversation on a late autumn evening that I have thought about most often since. The frost had come by then, the real plateau frost, not the preliminary chill, and the keep was loud with the organized activity of a household preparing for winter. I had been in sessions for most of the day. Supply reviews, patrol reassignments, a dispute between 2 of the lower ridge packs that had required careful handling and 3 hours of my patience. I came to the library later than usual, tired in the specific way of someone who has spent a full day being a Lycan king and would very much like, for an hour, to simply be a person. She was already there, as she usually was. The inventories were pushed to one side. She was looking at one of the older record books, not the supply tallies but the court histories, the earlier ones, written in a hand that required practice to read. "There's a passage in here," she said when I came in without preamble, About a king who kept the plateau alone for 40 years. My great-grandfather, I said, taking my chair. Verk, he was not a sociable man. The record says he kept the keep in good order, she said. Every supply line, every border accord, every winter survived. She turned a page. It also says that his steward wrote in a private entry appended at the end of his life that Verk had been the most competent and the most lonely king the plateau had known. She said it without looking up, without emphasis. And your great-grandfather, she continued, never seemed to know these were different things. He thought keeping the keep in order was enough. That it would fill the space. It fills most of the space, I said. Yes, she said, then quietly, does it fill all of it? The fire in the grate had burned down to coals, and the room was in the particular amber light that comes when the lamp is the primary source. And outside the deep-set window the plateau was already dark and already cold. No, I said. She looked up then. We looked at each other across the room, across the worn table and the old records and the amber light, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. I didn't expect this place, she said at last, quietly. What did you expect? I expected to be useful and invisible. I've done that before, I know how. A pause. I didn't expect the wolves. I didn't expect the library. Another pause, even quieter. I didn't expect you to leave the lamp lit. I was silent for a moment. I didn't expect to, I said. She looked down at the old record in her hands, and the fire shifted in the grate, and the room was very quiet. After a while she said, without looking up, my family didn't find it difficult to send me. I know, I said. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had been useful enough and would be useful here, and that was what I was for. A pause. I've been telling myself that for a long time. How long? She thought about it, long enough that I stopped noticing I was doing it. She turned a page she wasn't reading. The wolves noticed before I did, I think, that I had stopped. I was quiet. They're very sincere animals, she said. They are, I said. She set the book down gently and looked at me again across the amber room, and I was aware, had been aware for some time, more acutely than I had found convenient, that the thing I had been calling policy and practicality and the management of a border compact was not any of those things and had not been for a while. What it was, I was not ready to name in the library, but I knew what it was. It was Elder Voss who brought it to a head, 3 weeks before the midwinter feast. He came to me in the morning council, with the other elders present, and laid out his case with the efficiency of a man who has prepared his argument carefully and intends to use it. The compact's term was 3 years, but there was a clause, he had found it, buried in the secondary provisions, that allowed either party to dissolve the arrangement at the 1-year mark if, in the judgment of the Lycan king, the compact's purpose had been served or the arrangement was no longer in keeping with the needs of the pack. The border with the Senevar family was stable. The Lower Ridge dispute had been resolved without needing the compact's assurance. The arrangement, Elder Voss said, had been useful and was now complete. He recommended that she be released from the compact, thanked formally, and returned to the lowlands. He was not wrong about the border. He was not wrong about the dispute. He was careful, methodical, and completely correct about the provisions of the compact. Elder Crane said nothing and watched me. Aldrich watched the table. I let Voss finish. I let the silence after his conclusion sit for long enough that the room understood I had heard every word. Then I said, no. Voss blinked. My lord, the provision is clear. I've read the compact, Voss. I wrote half of it. Then you understand that the release clause is a clause that requires my judgment, I said. I'm exercising it. A pause. The arrangement no longer serves a strategic. That's not what the clause says. The clause says in keeping with the needs of the pack. I'm the Lycan king of this pack. I determine what it needs. Voss was quiet. Around the table, the other elders were doing the very careful work of being neutral. My lord, Voss said more carefully now, the compact girl she is untitled. She has no standing in the pack hierarchy. She cannot be considered for. I'm not consulting the hierarchy, I said. I'm informing it. The room went very still. I stood. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply that certain things are better said on one's feet. Senna of the Senavar Compact is under my protection and will remain in Valethorn for as long as she chooses to stay, I said. Her position is no longer that of Compact Keeper. Her position is whatever I determine it to be, and I will determine it shortly. If any member of this council has an objection that pertains to the governance of this pack, I will hear it. If the objection pertains to my personal judgment, I suggest you consider very carefully whether that is a conversation you want to have with me. No one spoke. Good, I said, then we're done. I left the council room and went, for the first time in the daylight hours, to the eastern wing. She was in the stores, as she usually was in the mornings, with the winter ledger open on the long table and the lamp positioned to catch the narrow window's light. The 7 wolves were arranged around the room with the comfort of animals who have decided a space belongs to them. She looked up when I came in. I was aware, standing in the doorway, that I had said several very definitive things in the council room without having first consulted the person they primarily concerned. This was not my finest exercise in deliberation. I had operated on the assumption that what I felt was, in some meaningful sense, returned, on the basis of amber library evenings, and the wolves and a lamp kept lit, and a conversation about loneliness and what it fills and what it does not. These were not nothing. But they were not explicit. I told the council you were staying, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Did you ask me first? No, I said. She was quiet. Why not? Because I was in the council room and you were here, and Voss was in the middle of releasing you from the compact. A pause. I'll ask you now. She set the ledger down. One of the wolves, the eldest, a gray and serious animal named Kale, put his head in her lap, and she put her hand on him without looking down, the way she always did, the easy reflex of someone who has become at home with something. What exactly are you asking? She said. I'm asking you to stay, I said. Not under the compact, not as the store's keeper. I'm asking you to stay as I considered, and then stopped considering and said it plainly, because I had been Lycan king long enough to know that plainness, while not comfortable, was usually right. I'm asking you to stay as mine, if you'll have me. The room was very quiet. Outside, the gorge wind was moving along the keep's outer walls, the particular sound it made in autumn when the plateau cold was beginning to settle in for the winter. She looked at me for a long moment, not the evaluating look of someone making a calculation. The look of someone who has learned to be careful with hope because hope has not always proven reliable and is deciding, carefully, whether this is different. I came here with nothing, she said. I know. I expected nothing. I know. She was quiet for another moment. Then, the wolves chose before I did. They usually know first, I said. She looked down at Kale, whose head was still heavy in her lap, and something in her face changed, not dramatically, not with the particular brightness that might accompany a declaration. More quietly than that. The way a door opens when someone who has been standing outside for a very long time decides, finally, to go in. Yes, she said. That was all. One word, quiet and certain, and the wolves around the room shifted, settled, as if something they had been waiting to resolve had resolved. I brought her to the great hall that evening. Not with ceremony. I am not a man who finds ceremony useful when directness will do, but with the deliberateness that the occasion required. My senior counsel was at the high table. The household staff were at their places. The evening meal was an ordinary meal, and I made it an ordinary entrance, except that she was beside me rather than in the eastern wing, and I had made sure that every person in that hall saw it. Elder Voss saw it. His expression did what expressions do when a man has been very certain of something and is now required to reconsider without the benefit of additional time. Elder Crane saw it and inclined his head and looked briefly like a man who is not surprised. Aldrich saw it and poured himself more wine with the studied neutrality of a general who has learned to engage only the battles he was asked to fight. I seated Senna at the high table to my right. She sat with the same composure she had brought to the gate on her first day, the composure that asked nothing of anyone, except that it was different now, because I was beside her and I was asking something of her, and she had said yes. I did not make a speech. I did not announce her. I sat down and we had the meal, and the hall was loud with the ordinary sound of a keep at dinner, and somewhere in the middle of it she said something low to me about the supply projection for the upper ridge, and I told her what I knew about it, and she said the numbers I had were 2 weeks old and she had the current ones, and I said that was exactly the kind of thing I needed. She looked at me. "Is that why you asked me to stay?" she said. "The ledger numbers." "No," I said. "Good," she said, and turned back to her food, and the corner of her mouth did something quiet and private that I thought I would spend a long time looking for. I named her before the pack formally at the midwinter feast. It was done with the old form, the Lycan king's hand covering the bond mark, which had appeared on her wrist 3 days after I had asked her to stay, appearing quietly in the night the way such marks did in the oldest traditions, as if the deciding was one thing and the confirming was another. I had been awake when she came to find me early morning to show me. I had taken her hand and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "Is this what it does?" she said. "In the old stories," I said. "I didn't know it still happened." She looked at it too for a moment. "Your grandmother's bond stone was warm this morning." "I know," I said. "I checked." She had looked at me, then with the careful attention she gave to things she was deciding about, and then she had laughed, briefly, softly, a sound that I had not heard from her before, and that did something very specific to the part of me that had been empty for 31 years. "All right," she said. "All right," I said. At the midwinter feast I held her hand in front of every elder, every pack senior, every household staff member, every wolf, and I said the old words in the old form, that she was the bond-marked mate of the Lycan king of Valethorn, chosen and cherished, first and permanent, and that Valethorn's pack was her pack as it was mine from this night forward. Voss sat in his place and looked like a man digesting something difficult, which was his right and his problem, and I did not concern myself with it. Crane stood, and the other elders stood after him, and then the household stood, and the hall was loud in the way it had not been loud in my memory. Senna stood beside me through all of it with the composure she had arrived with, except that it was different now, and I knew why it was different, because I knew what she had come in with and what the composure had been protecting. She was not protecting anything now. She was simply herself, in the hall of the keep that was hers, holding my hand, with 7 wolves arranged at her feet in the loose and comfortable way of animals who have been certain of this longer than anyone. After the feast, when the hall had quieted and the household had gone to their wings, and the fire in the great hearth was burning low, we walked the main corridor together. She was tired, it had been a long evening, and she leaned slightly into my side without making a particular thing of it, the easy lean of someone who has decided that the thing they are leaning on will hold. We passed the moon seal. It was lit. Not the faint warmth it had been these past weeks. Lit, fully, the silver lines running clear and bright in the pale stone, the way it must have looked 300 years ago when the keep was new, and the bond stone was new, and someone walked through this corridor with the pack's heart beside them for the first time. We both stopped. She looked down at it for a long moment, then she looked at me. "Your grandmother's story," she said. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the lit stone in the dark corridor, and then she looked back up at me with an expression that I had no single word for, something in the register of wonder, but older than wonder, the feeling of a person who has been hungry for a very long time and has finally, quietly, sat down at a table. "I didn't know I was looking for this," she said. "Neither did I said. She leaned her head against my shoulder briefly, and we stood there in the light of the moon seal for a while, the Lycan king of Valethorn, and the woman who had arrived with one bag and a cloak too light for autumn, and the composure of someone who had long since stopped expecting anything. And the bond stone lit the old corridor, and the wolves were somewhere behind us, and the keep was quiet and warm. I had ruled Valethorn for 31 years. I had kept the borders and the supply lines and the winter counts and the plateau accords. I had been, by every measure I knew how to apply, competent. I had not known, until she walked through the gate with nothing, how hungry I had been. She knew. I think she had always known, in the way that people who have been hungry themselves can recognize it in others without needing it explained. She had come here expecting to be useful and invisible. She had expected to keep the stores and tend the ledgers and take up as little space as possible and go home in 3 years with the same nothing she had arrived with. Instead, she had walked through the corridor each morning, and the bond stone had warmed, and my wolves had chosen her before I could, and we had sat in a library in amber light and talked about the difference between filling a space and filling it completely. And one late autumn morning, I had stood in her doorway and asked her plainly to stay. She had said yes. That was all it required in the end. Not ceremony and not strategy and not the careful architecture of a border accord. Just two people who had been alone long enough to recognize the shape of it in each other, and the honesty, finally, to say so. The bondstone shone in the dark corridor, and Valethorn was warm around us. And that hunger, the particular, specific 31-year hunger of a Lycan king who had been ruling in exact and lonely competence, was answered at last by the woman beside me, who had arrived with nothing and was the only thing I had been missing.